When Daniel opened his son's laptop that evening, he only intended to finish a work report. His own computer had crashed that morning with a sudden blue screen, and deadlines left him no choice but to borrow his son Adrian's. It should have been a simple task, yet as soon as Chrome launched, Daniel froze. His heart clenched painfully against his ribs. On the screen, tab after tab displayed explicit gay videos unapologetically open, glaring like neon signs he could not unsee. His hand hovered over the mouse, but he couldn't move. For a moment, all the air seemed to leave the room, leaving him gasping in a silence that roared louder than any shout Daniel hadn't expected. This Adrian had always been the athletic boy, obsessed with martial arts, dreaming of getting into a prestigious sports university. He carried himself with quiet strength, polite to a fault, with that familiar, mischievous smile Daniel thought he knew by heart. There were no signs. Or perhaps there were, but Daniel had been too blind to notice, too comfortable with the version of his son he had constructed in his mind. Now sitting in the fading light of the living room, Daniel realized something that scared him more than anything else. Maybe he had never really seen Adrian at all. His mind raced, clashing between reason and fear. He wasn't angry. It wasn't about being ashamed. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name yet, a hollow ache of realizing he might have failed as a father. Adrian had been carrying this truth alone, tucked away behind browser tabs and hurriedly closed windows, hiding not because of who he was, but because he feared what his father might do if he knew. The house suddenly felt suffocating. Daniel slammed the laptop shut without thinking and stumbled out the front door like a man chased by his own guilt. The cold air slapped his face, but it wasn't enough to clear his head. He walked aimlessly, his hands jammed into his jacket pockets, his breathing shallow. It wasn't Adrian's identity that broke him. It was the knowledge that his son hadn't trusted him enough to share it. In a country where being different could mean being hated, could mean danger. Daniel had prided himself on being a good father, a safe place. Now he wasn't so sure. The guilt gnawed at him as he wandered farther from the house. His wife Elena was staying with her parents for the week to care for her recovering mother. She didn't know. At least Daniel assumed she didn't. Should he tell her? Should he talk to Adrian first? Every possible scenario spiraled in his mind until it became impossible to think straight. All he knew was that he needed to fix this somehow. He sat on a bench outside the grocery store, staring at the pavement as shoppers bustled past their lives intact. Uncomplicated, Daniel clenched his fists. He could not afford to mess this up. Adrian was preparing for university exams, already shouldering the pressure of expectations. The last thing his son needed was to carry the burden of a father's disappointment too. Daniel knew he had to say something. He couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. But how do you tell your son that you love him no matter what, when your first reaction was to run away? How did you undo the damage silence can cause in a heart already bruised by fear? He realized he needed more than just words. He needed to show Adrian that nothing had changed, that he was still and would always be his son. With a trembling breath, Daniel stood up, wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, and walked into the store. He grabbed a six-pack of beer and a bucket of fried chicken, the comfort foods they always shared during late-night movie marathons. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was a start, a way to walk back into the house without making everything heavier than it already was. As he paid at the counter, Daniel caught his reflection in the store's glass window. Tired eyes, lined forehead, a man who was scared but determined. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "I won't lose you, Adrian." Not to fear, not to shame, not to anything. Holding the warm bag of chicken and the cool wit of beer in his hands, Daniel turned back toward home, unaware that what awaited him inside was more fragile and more hopeful than he could ever imagine. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories, where real moments of love, resilience, and family come alive. Your support helps bring more untold stories into the light. The house was eerily quiet when Daniel returned, the kind of silence that clung to the walls and soaked into the floorboards. His keys jingled too loudly in his hand as he turned the knob, stepping inside with the beer and chicken balanced awkwardly against his chest. He called out a soft, "I'm home," but no answer came. Only the hum of the refrigerator responded. Daniel set the food down on the kitchen counter, suddenly hyper-aware of every small noise, the tick of the clock, the faint drip of a leaking faucet, the distant rumble of a car passing by. He wiped his palms against his jeans again, his stomach twisted painfully. Part of him wanted to march straight into Adrian's room, force a conversation, lay it all bare, but something told him to wait, to tread carefully. He noticed the laptop still sitting on the coffee table, closed but ominously present, like a wound hastily bandaged. Daniel's chest tightened. Had Adrian already seen it? Had he realized his father had fled like a coward? A pang of guilt stabbed through him. He had meant to protect his son from judgment, from cruelty, not to become another source of pain. Slowly, Daniel made his way down the hallway. Adrian's door was slightly ajar, a thin strip of light spilling out across the carpet. As he approached, he heard it, a muffled, broken sound, half choked, half swallowed. Crying, Daniel stopped just outside the door, pressing his forehead lightly against the cool wood. For a moment, he couldn't move. All he could do was listen to the sound of his son crying, each sob a dagger to the heart. He imagined Adrian curled up inside, torn between fear and shame, convinced that his father hated him. The thought nearly brought Daniel to his knees. He raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked gently. No answer. He pushed the door open a little wider. Adrian sat hunched on the bed, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking violently. His phone lay discarded beside him, the screen still lit with a call log. Daniel caught a glimpse of the name, Uncle Matthew, his brother. Relief flickered somewhere deep in Daniel's chest. At least Adrian hadn't been completely alone. The sight of his son, usually so composed, so resilient, reduced to this fragile, crumbling figure, shattered Daniel's last reserves of hesitation. He stepped inside, moving slowly, careful not to startle him. Adrian looked up, his eyes red and swollen, a flicker of panic flashing across his face before he quickly wiped his cheeks with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. Daniel sat down at the edge of the bed, leaving enough space to not crowd him, but close enough to bridge the gap. He opened the bag of fried chicken, the scent filling the room warm and familiar. He cracked open a beer and set it down between them without a word. Small, stupid gestures, but gestures nonetheless. Adrian sniffled, glancing at the food, then back at his father. His lips trembled as he spoke, voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Are you mad at me?" Daniel's heart broke cleanly in two. So much weight behind such a simple question. Years of fear, of second-guessing, of building walls just to survive, all crammed into 5 shaky words. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I'm not mad. I'm just sorry. Sorry that you ever thought you had to hide from me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them hung heavy, filled with everything unsaid. Adrian's shoulders sagged as he stared at his hands. I thought you hated me. I thought you left because you couldn't even look at me." Daniel swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I left because I was scared," he admitted. "Not of you, never of you. I was scared that I had failed you, that I hadn't made you feel safe enough to be who you are." A single tear slipped down Adrian's cheek. He wiped it away quickly, but Daniel caught it not with his hands, but with his heart. He had spent so many years protecting Adrian from the harshness of the world outside, never realizing that sometimes the harshest battlefield was the silence inside their own home. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, choosing every word carefully. "I love you, Adrian. Exactly as you are always." Adrian's face crumpled. He let out a soft, broken laugh somewhere between a sob and a sigh, and before Daniel could process it, his son leaned into him, burying his face in Daniel's shoulder. It was a clumsy, desperate embrace, but Daniel wrapped his arms around him tightly, feeling the thin tremors of Adrian's body against his own. They stayed like that for a long time, the chicken growing cold, the beer forgotten. Nothing else mattered. Not the world outside. Not the expectations or the judgments or the long history of silence between them. Just this. 2 flawed, scared human beings finding each other again in the wreckage. When Adrian finally pulled back, his eyes were clearer, steadier. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and gave a small, sheepish smile. "I called Uncle Matthew," he confessed. "I didn't know what to do." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm glad you did." The evening, once poised on the edge of disaster, had taken a different turn, but there were still things left unsaid, hidden deeper than either of them had dared to touch. Yet Daniel could feel it, a tremor beneath the fragile peace they had managed to rebuild. And before the night ended, the truth would come to light. Truth. Neither of them were fully prepared to face. Daniel and Adrian sat together in the soft, dim light of the bedroom. An invisible wall between them slowly dissolving, but not yet gone. The bag of chickens sat untouched on the bed, its aroma fading into the background. For a while, they just existed in the same space, letting the silence mend what it could not yet say. Daniel stared at the carpet, tracing invisible patterns, with his eyes gathering the courage for the conversation he knew they both needed. Adrian picked at the corner of a pillow, his fingers restless, betraying the nervous energy still coiled inside him. The bond between them, strained but not broken, hung in the air, fragile as glass. It was Adrian who spoke first, voice small but steady. "I thought about telling you so many times." His fingers tightened around the fabric, twisting it between his hands. But every time I tried, something would stop me, like this voice in my head telling me, "You wouldn't want me anymore." Daniel's chest ached at the thought. His son carrying this fear alone for so long, while under his roof, under his care, believing himself unloved for something as simple as natural as who he was. He turned slightly, forcing Adrian to meet his eyes. "That voice lied," Daniel said quietly. "You are my son. That has never changed. It never will." Adrian's lip quivered, but he managed a nod. The bravery it took for him to sit here to say these things out loud filled Daniel with a deep, aching pride. Adrian exhaled shakily and continued, his words tumbling out faster now, as if afraid he would lose the courage if he paused. "Uncle Matthew was the first person I told. It was last year. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore." He paused, glancing up as if checking for judgment, but finding none, only the steady, patient weight of his father's attention. He didn't even blink, just hugged me and said he was proud of me. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Daniel's eyes. He had always known Matthew was different, quieter, more private, but he had never questioned it. The thought that his own brother might have seen parts of Adrian he had missed tightened the knot in Daniel's stomach. "He told me to be careful," Adrian said, "to wait until I had my own money, my own place, that not everyone would react like he did." Daniel nodded slowly. He was right. This world, it's not always kind. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through it. "But you're strong, and you're not alone." Adrian smiled weakly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a way that mirrored Daniel's own expressions from years past. It was a smile Daniel had missed seeing, buried under all the fear and hiding. The weight in the room shifted lighter, but not yet free. There was still more. Daniel could feel it lingering at the edges. "There's something else," Adrian said hesitantly, his fingers worrying the hem of his sweatshirt. "Something I never told anyone but Uncle Matthew. And I think you deserve to know." Daniel's heart stumbled. He braced himself, not out of fear of Adrian's truth, but fear of how much pain it had cost him to keep it hidden. Adrian swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "When I was younger, there was someone, a cousin from Mom's side, at a family gathering. I was just a kid, and he touched me." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He sucked in a sharp breath, feeling the blood drain from his face. His hands clenched into fists against his knees, nails digging into skin. "I didn't know what to do," Adrian said, his eyes wet but determined. "I thought maybe it was my fault. Maybe that's why I'm the way I am." His voice cracked on the last words as Daniel moved without thinking, reaching for his son's hand and gripping it tightly. "No," he said fiercely, his voice low but firm. "That was not your fault. It never was. And who you are, it's not something broken. It's not something wrong." Adrian's shoulders shook as he tried to hold back sobs, but Daniel didn't let go. He anchored them both, a father finally seeing the whole messy, painful truth of his son's life and refusing to turn away. "You didn't deserve that," Daniel whispered. "You deserve to be safe, to be loved without fear." Adrian nodded through his tears, pressing his forehead against the back of Daniel's hand. The room swirled with emotions too big for words. Grief for what had been stolen. Rage at the injustice, sorrow for the years of silence. But beneath it all, something stronger took root. A fierce, unyielding love that no mistake, no pain, no past could ever undo. They sat there long after the tears had dried, after the fried chicken had grown cold and the beer had gone flat. Two wounded souls no longer hiding from each other, beginning the slow, painful process of healing. In the soft hush of the evening, Daniel realized something profound. Adrian wasn't just brave for surviving. He was brave for trusting again, for sitting here offering his shattered pieces and hoping they would be held with care. Daniel made a silent vow, one he etched into every fiber of his being. Whatever storms might come, whatever battles Adrian would face, he would never again have to face them alone. But even as the quiet returned to the house, neither of them knew that the night still held one final revelation, one that would change Daniel's understanding of family love and loyalty forever. The evening pressed on, dense with emotion, but laced now with something else. Unfamiliar peace. Daniel and Adrian sat in the living room, the television on, but muted, neither really paying attention to the shifting colors on the screen. They had said the hardest things. They had cracked open old wounds and dared to look at them together. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that something still hovered just beyond the horizon, a truth waiting for its moment to break free. The doorbell rang sharp and sudden. Adrian flinched slightly, but then a faint smile tugged at his lips. "It's Uncle Matthew," he said, rising to his feet. Daniel followed, his heart beating a little faster. He wasn't sure what he would say to his brother. Thank you seemed too small for what Matthew had given his son. The quiet shelter, the steady presence, the proof that Adrian was never as alone as he had feared. When Daniel opened the door, Matthew stood there with a bag slung over one shoulder, his jacket dusted with light rain. His face was lined with worry, but the moment he saw Adrian standing there, whole and upright, a flash of pure relief crossed his features. "You good, kid?" Matthew asked, voice low, careful. Adrian nodded. "We're good." Matthew's gaze shifted to Daniel, searching, measuring. For a heartbeat, the two brothers simply looked at each other, an entire lifetime. Of unspoken things compressed into that moment, Daniel stepped back and let him in. They gathered around the kitchen table, the untouched beer now distributed between them like peace offerings. Adrian sipped his quietly, his hand brushing against Daniel's, once a small, unconscious gesture of trust that Daniel treasured more than words. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his expression more relaxed now, but there was something guarded about him, a layer of tension that hadn't quite dissolved. "You handled it better than most would," Matthew said, finally breaking the fragile silence. Daniel shook his head. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I almost let my fear make me the person Adrian was afraid of." "You didn't," Matthew said simply, as if that alone was enough. Daniel looked at his brother, really looked, and for the first time noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way Matthew's smile never quite reached his eyes, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the careful way he navigated every conversation. Pieces of a puzzle Daniel had never realized he was missing. "You were the one he turned to," Daniel said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you." Matthew shrugged, but there was a heaviness in the motion. "Someone had to be there?" The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been. Adrian looked between the two men, then back at Matthew. "You never told him, did you?" Daniel frowned. "Told me what?" Matthew shifted in his seat, staring at the condensation forming on his beer bottle. For a long time he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was low and steady, as if he had practiced these words many times in his mind, but had never dared say them aloud. "I'm gay, Daniel," Matthew said. "I always have been." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Daniel blinked, trying to process the words, trying to stitch them into the framework of the man he thought he knew. Memories flashed through his mind. Matthew turning down dates, sidestepping conversations about marriage, moving away from their small judgmental hometown, without much explanation. Daniel had seen it all, and yet he had never seen it. "I didn't tell you because I saw how things were." Matthew continued, his voice raw but controlled. "I saw how everyone talked about people like me. I didn't want to be another disappointment, especially not to you." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. Shame flooded him. Hot and suffocating, not because Matthew was gay, but because somewhere along the way, Daniel had made his own brother feel that silence was safer than truth. Adrian reached across the table and squeezed Matthew's hand, a silent thread of solidarity that made Daniel's eyes sting. "You weren't a disappointment," Daniel said finally, his voice rough. "Not ever." Matthew gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe not to you now, but back then it was easier to just disappear a little." Daniel's chest ached with a grief he didn't know how to name. Grief for the years lost between them, for the times Matthew had suffered alone, while Daniel lived comfortably in ignorance. He thought about Adrian sitting alone with his fears and realized that the pattern had been there all along. Unseen, unbroken, "I'm sorry." Daniel said the words barely a whisper. Matthew shrugged again, but this time it was lighter, as if speaking the truth had lifted a great weight off his shoulders. "I'm not telling you to make you feel bad, I thought you should know. It's why I understood Adrian so well, why I knew what he needed." Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. They sat there, the three of them, bound not by shared blood alone, but now by a deeper, fiercer kind of loyalty, the kind forged in honesty, in survival, in love, that had withstood every attempt to silence it. As the clock ticked quietly in the background, Daniel realized something he had never considered before: family was not about fitting into an image others had designed. Family was about showing up when it mattered most, about standing in the gap for each other when the world tried to push you into darkness. He had failed Matthew once. He would not fail Adrian now. Outside, the rain continued to fall soft and steady against the windows. But inside that little kitchen, something new had begun to grow, fragile, tentative, but real. A family broken open and mended not by perfection, but by love. Brave enough to face the truth, and yet even as the night wound down, Daniel had the strange feeling that the biggest surprise was still waiting just around the corner. The rain outside had softened into a gentle mist by the time Daniel, Adrian, and Matthew moved into the living room, abandoning the kitchen and its half-eaten food. The night had stretched long, but none of them seemed eager to let it end. There was something sacred about what they had built together in those few hours, something Daniel wasn't ready to release back into the ordinary. Matthew rummaged through his bag and pulled out an old battered DVD case. He tossed it onto the coffee table with a smirk. "Thought we could use something stupid to watch," he said. "Remember this?" Daniel laughed under his breath. It was a martial arts movie they had loved as teenagers, full of terrible acting and dramatic fight scenes that had once seemed like the height of cinema. Adrian picked it up, studying the cover like it was an ancient artifact. "This looks awful," he said, but there was laughter in his voice, light and genuine. "Exactly," Matthew grinned. They crowded onto the couch, Daniel in the middle, Adrian and Matthew flanking him. As the movie began, the room filled with the familiar crackle of old dialogue and the ridiculous swoosh of fake punches. For the first time in what felt like years, Daniel allowed himself to laugh without reservation. Adrian leaned against his shoulder, a quiet, trusting weight. Matthew threw popcorn at the screen whenever the acting got too terrible, which was often. It wasn't a perfect night. It wasn't some grand, orchestrated gesture of reconciliation, but it was real. It was messy and honest and full of a kind of love that didn't need to be explained. Somewhere around the third over-the-top fight scene, Adrian turned to Daniel, his expression serious. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for staying." Daniel swallowed hard against the sudden lump in his throat. He wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him in a little tighter. "There's nowhere else I would ever want to be," he said. The rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft applause from the world outside. As the credits rolled, Daniel turned to Matthew. "You really were terrible at hiding things, you know," he said, teasing gently. Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Takes one to know one big brother." They laughed, but beneath the laughter was a shared understanding, a mutual promise to do better, to be better for themselves and for the next generation. Before heading to bed, Adrian hesitated at the stairs, looking back over his shoulder. Maybe one day, he said almost to himself, it won't have to be a secret anymore for any of us. Daniel met his gaze and nodded, one day soon. As Adrian disappeared upstairs, Daniel and Matthew remained seated, the muted glow of the television washing over them. Daniel realized that tonight wasn't just about forgiving the past. It was about choosing a new future, one where no one would ever have to question their place at the table. Outside, the mist lifted, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he could breathe freely again. Families don't break because of the truth. They break because of the silence. And tonight, Daniel knew his family had found its voice. What about you? Have you ever had a conversation that changed everything you thought you knew about love of the Lovey Mountain family? Share your story in the comments. And if this one touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Heart Stories, where every story is a reminder that real love always finds a way home.